think we're going to go ahead and get started with flex and rigid flex today. I'm Tara Dunn, and I have a couple quick questions to get started today. How many people here, quick show of hands, are just thinking about flex or getting started and relatively new to flex and rigid flex? Great. And how many people are industry veterans, been designing with flex and rigid flex forever? Great. And even more importantly, is there anybody in the room right now that was in my flex session last year at AltiumLive? Okay, good. I'm going to give myself a chance to redeem myself after that presentation last year. Okay. So I think technically the presentation was just fine, but the execution of delivering that content was probably the worst I've ever done in 20 years. It was pretty bad. Started out thinking I was way cooler than I am, and I could walk across the room and talk. I can't. I ended up stopping in front of the projector. I had polka dots all over my face. Somebody kindly pointed that out to me. I also had put the microphone on the wrong side, so every time I turned to the screen, nobody could hear me. So I pointed that out, loud crashing noise, moving my microphone around. And then they had some cables down here on the floor that I proceeded to trip over for the next 45 minutes. No less than 10 times, go flying forward, lose my train of thought. It was the longest 45 minutes ever, okay? But getting ready for today's program, I'm like, all right, that was a trying experience, but what lessons did I learn? You'll notice my microphone is on the right side. I'm not gonna walk over by the projector, and because there are still cables here, I'm gonna lock myself down at the podium. We won't have any repeats of last time. And kind of along that same line of challenging situations and lessons learned, the format of today's presentation is going to be war stories, right? Things that went wrong when you work with flex and rigid flex, and lessons learned, and tips and tricks to kind of avoid some of that. So some of the stories are going to be mine, and some of them are ones that I've borrowed from other friends that I thought were interesting and maybe relevant for today. The first one I'm going to start out with is one from about 20 years ago. It's the first one in my memory that was truly challenging. Like I said, it sticks in my memory still 20 years later. So the design comes in. It's a very simple double-sided flex. So the trace is on the top side, solid copper shield on the back side, rectangular in shape. It's like 10 or 12 mil trace in space, very large, 12 mil drilled. Nothing out of the ordinary about that design at all. Built it, shipped it, really gave it very little thought until I get the phone call, hey Tara, something's wrong. This flex isn't working. Okay, so how is it being used? That was my first question. You know, I didn't know how it was being bent or flexed in use. We just had the 2D files. Found that it was bending, not necessarily any way that was going to concern us, but we started to go down the progression of how to make that a little bit more flexible. So we changed materials. We started out with adhesive base. We switched to adhesive-less, so it would be a little bit thinner, give you a bigger bend radius. And then we cross-hatched the shield on the back side in the area that it's going to flex. Great, ran some prototypes, shipped them. A couple of weeks later, hey Tara, we still got a problem. This isn't working. I'm like, okay, do some more talking, some more brainstorming. Proceeded to eliminate all material in that bend area. We oriented the part in the grain direction of the material to make it a little bit more flexible, and then we added polyimide stiffeners on each side of that bend area, so we were certain it was only bending in the area that it was designed to bend in. Shipped the parts, phone call, again, Tara, this isn't working, and we were all like, what is going on? So finally grabbed my entire team of very smart engineers that I was working with, and we went up to the customer's facility and started looking at the flex in use. And it was just a nice, gentle bend. There was nothing that you would think would be causing these kind of problems until suddenly somebody stopped and said, hey, wait a minute. So instead of it bending like this, it was bending like this with a little tweak at the end. That tweak was cracking all of those traces. Very simple fix. We didn't even redesign. We just kept that really flexible flex for them, and they've been running them for years, or did run them for years. So what were the lessons learned from that? You know, first of all, is I ask questions, much more probing questions earlier. Can I get pictures of how it's being used? Can we have video, right? But the other thing that really stands out is that was really a good lesson in the progression of all the different things you can do to make a circuit more flexible when you're worried about the bending and folding, right? We crosshatched the shield, grain direction, added polyimide stiffeners. So many different tips and tricks that you can use when you're working with the flex circuit. I was going to stop there and talk about the benefits, but I'm going to go through more stories instead. This is space, weight, packaging, and flexibility, right? Benefits of flex circuits. And because there was quite a few people who are relatively new to flex, I'm going to spend a few minutes on the basics of the flex materials. And because we're a little short on time, I'm just going to talk about the predominant material, which is the copper and polyimide laminate. So in laminates, there's a wide variety of choices. You can have anything, half-ounce copper to 2-ounce copper, half-mil polyimide to 5-mil polyimide, and all different combinations of that. And all of these laminates are going to come in two different types. There's going to be adhesive-based and adhesive-less. So adhesive-based will be typically an acrylic adhesive or a flame retardant adhesive. Adhesive-less, as the name implies, eliminates that adhesive in the laminate. And then why would you choose one type over the other? Typically adhesive-based materials, they're very, very common for single-sided, double-sided, low layer count flex. It's probably the predominant material being used in the industry, I would say. Adhesive-less is always going to be recommended for high layer count to help keep your overall thickness reduced, and then also always going to be recommended for rigid flex. So you don't want to introduce the acrylic adhesive portion of that stack up. Cover lay options, two primary types of cover lay that we see. There's a flexible liquid photoimageable cover lay. That works very well for applications that are flex to install or have a low number of flexes over the course of the life. For more flexible requirements, dynamically flexing, we're going to probably recommend the polyimide cover lay. Liquid photoimageable cover lay allows you to define those tight surface mount pad areas. So it does a very nice job with that. Polyimide cover lay can't get quite as tight of feature sizes with that, but again, it is much more flexible. And then stiffeners, two different types of stiffeners that we see with flex. The predominant one that you'll see is FR4. That's going to be used to support a component area primarily. A lot of times you're going to have like a heavy connector and a very thin, lightweight flex. That's going to cause a lot of stress on the flex material itself. Or even if you just have a series of dense, smaller components, it gives a little bit of rigidity to that circuit for you. The polyimide stiffeners, on the other hand, are kind of more of a workhorse. They do a lot of different things. Zero insertion force connectors is a popular way to terminate a flex, and that requires a very specific thickness in that flex to install area. Polyimide stiffener is predominantly used to build that thickness up to what it needs to be. But it can also be used in a wear area. If you're going to have something rubbing against the flex in use, put a stiffener in that area. And then you're rubbing on the polyimide stiffener rather than rubbing on the circuit layers themselves. And as I mentioned in the earlier example, it can also be used to kind of create the bend area or ensure that your flex is bending and folding in exactly the manner that you designed it to. Now back to the stories. How many people in the room have had the flex that didn't flex? Really? There you go. I think most people at some point after they've been using flex for a while will have the flex that didn't flex. This one is another example of mine. We had worked very diligently on the stack up for this. It was a 6-layer rigid flex. It had some crazy impedance requirements that we were trying to match. We ended up with some pretty thick copper, thick Kapton. But we met the impedance requirements. Shipped the parts. Thought everything went fine. I went into the customer for just a regularly scheduled meeting, and they're like, "Hey, Tara, we got something for you." I'm like, "Oh, great. What do we have?" They hand me this flex. And I'm like, "What is it?" Try to bend it. And I couldn't bend it. I mean, it didn't even move at all. It was solid as a rock. And there I sit, and they're like, "How did you ship me a flex that doesn't flex? What were you thinking? Didn't somebody somewhere along the line before this ship think this might be a problem?" I'm like, "Oh boy, this is going to be fun." So in this case, it was a very easy fix. we just simply went with loose leaf construction or unbonded layers that you see over on this side over there. Very easy solution once I got over the embarrassment of shipping somebody a flex that didn't flex. But the other lesson learned is, the thickness actually does accumulate much faster than you think, especially when you're using solid copper shielding. So always pay attention to the overall thickness and the bend radius that you're going to need. And another flex that didn't flex story. This one wasn't mine. I just borrowed this story, but I thought it was a good one. This was a OEM startup going for their first medical wearable. It wasn't going to be a watch, or something like that. It was going to be something that's going to be on your clothing. So they decided to go with flex material for the obvious reasons of being lightweight and more flexible. But they were brand new to flex, had not used flex materials before. And in the course of doing some research, stumbled upon thin core FR4. You can get that in 2 mil or 3 mil also, so they decided to use the thin core FR4 material instead of flex. It was commercially available, it was robust, and it was what they knew, right? And then they added flexible photo imageable cover lay to that to help make it as flexible as it could be. And I know you're probably sitting there going, well, I bet that rigid material cracked right away. And it did, right? Of course it did. Not understanding the material properties of what was involved, they changed cover lay. And they went with a polyimide cover lay to make it a little bit more flexible. And again, as you would expect, that rigid material cracked right away. So they kind of stopped, went back to the drawing board, redesigned it as a flex. Worked perfectly. No problems at all. Lesson learned. Rigid material is going to crack. Now, overall, I have to say that the supplier that originally started the design wasn't a PCB manufacturer. They were a foundry doing a bunch of other things for this company and just were doing a little bit of circuits on the side. I think if you had sent that design into a board manufacturer or flex manufacturer with rigid material and polyimide cover lay, all the bells and whistles would have went off. I mean, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense at all. But lesson learned, right? So always work with your fabricator when you're working with new materials. All right, do your research. Google is a wonderful resource for a lot of things, but it's always a good idea when you're starting out with something to just get involved with the fabricator if you're unsure, and ask 2 or 3 the same questions, see what kind of answers you get. Do your research with something new, but generally speaking, fabricators love to answer questions. So this is a good story. And as I'm telling this story, keep in mind that the company that was involved with this actually did the design, the fabrication, and the assembly all under one roof. And they still had these type of communication issues that we're going to talk about. So you can imagine how much more easily this could happen if you were doing your design in one place, fab somewhere else, and assembly in another part of the country even, right? So this case had a flex with a very heavy circular connector right in the middle. So the designer added the FR4, as we would all recommend to give stability to that, fabricated the circuit, it went to assembly, and the guy doing assembly is realizing that the FR4 is great, but it's still kind of wobbling enough that they're getting cracked traces. So he came up with what I think was a pretty creative solution to that, and added a piece of FR4 to the top side of the circuit. So now you got FR4 sandwiched on both sides of that polyimide, and then applying that heavy circular connector. Still was wobbling a little bit, still causing them some trouble with cracked traces. So went back to the drawing board. The guy from assembly went to go talk to the designer. Everybody got their head together. They cross-sectioned the component area that was cracking, made a first recommendation to go from 1 mil Kapton to 2 mil Kapton in the base laminate to give it a little more stability, but more importantly realized that for whatever reason, that component area wasn't flex-sized, as we would call it, right? Where you're going to want to add nice fillets and teardrops to the pad and trace interface. It's probably one of the highest stress areas in a flex design, is that area. So we always recommend teardrops. This one wasn't. Nobody really knows why. So they added all the fillets, ran the boards, everything worked great. And because we're talking about Stiffeners, I wanted to point out at the same time that when you're using stiffeners in your design, whether it's polyimide or FR4, always try to make sure that those are overlapping by about 30 mils or greater, so you're not adding another stress point on your flex design. I really want to walk, right? I'm going to trip again, so I'm going to try not to do that. Never underestimate the value of a mock-up. So I know, all the tools have 3D modeling, things that you can look and double check, and that's great. But sometimes you got to go the old-fashioned route and use, either a paper doll or a Mylar, or in this case, this particular example was a series of 5 or 6 chassis stacked on top of each other, very little head space. They weren't going to be able to go in and troubleshoot after assembly. And these were all interconnected with impedance-controlled 3-layer rigid flex that were thick enough that they were violating, or going to violate, all the bend radius recommendations. So going into this already knowing there's going to possibly be an issue, the program manager and the designer planned in extra time and extra money to actually go to the fabricator and get a mock-up of that flex, which I thought was a great idea. I think they had dummy rigid boards, but the flex, they actually etched the material exactly as it was going to be run, and then installed that, uninstalled it, and we're able to really look and evaluate how that flex was connecting, making sure that that was right, and then on top of that, making sure that they weren't going to have trouble with cracking or broken traces. So I thought, just planning that ahead of time and working with your fabricator really solved a lot of problems for them. And when I was talking to people about this presentation, asking people for stories and some of their best advice, a couple of things along this same line, especially when you're working with flex, was if you're going to work with a number of flex, start the design with the flex, because it's really easy to get things mixed up when things are bending and folding and going around corners, and the pinouts can get mixed up pretty easily. So they recommended starting with the flex. And actually went on to tell me what I thought was kind of a funny story, only because I wasn't involved with it. But it was like 6 or 7 flexes were being used, and they all had a service loop, and they weren't connecting the way they were supposed to. The pinouts weren't right. It was all confused and messed up when they started to try to assemble everything together. Program manager got irritated, frustrated, and just said, "That's it. Add 10 inches to every one of these circuits, and we're not going to have any trouble figuring out how to bend them and get them where they need to go." Well, first of all, it kind of makes you laugh, right? 10 inches is expensive in the world of flex. And it really didn't solve the problem, because at the end of the day, they just had a whole bunch of 10-inch loops going everywhere, and they still had trouble connecting the flex. So had they started with the flex first, they might have eliminated some of those problems. Forming a flex circuit. Okay, so not to be confused with just bending it when you install it, but truly forming it. The first piece of advice that was given about forming a flex is don't do it. Like, really don't do it unless you absolutely have no other choice. But assuming you have no other choice and you have to move forward with this, how do you do it? So the flex was designed with very heavy copper, very thick Kapton, all designed to really hold that shape as best as possible. And then a forming die is used to create the fold, and then it is baked, and then as it's cooled, it's placed in a cylinder to hold that form the best of the ability. Flex is going to always want to flatten back out. So they were having trouble with cracking in this case, and first thought, oh, it must be the die. Went and investigated all that. No, it wasn't the die that they were using. Okay, it must be the thick material, right? It's really thick material for this kind of fold. Determined it wasn't that. What they finally figured out, and this is the piece that I thought was interesting, because I think what they were doing was very logical. Prior to doing the forming, they were giving it a bake. So just heating it up a little bit, getting the adhesive a little more pliable, so when they went to go make that form, it would bend a little bit easier for them. Seems like a logical thing to do. But what they found out was, as they heated up that material and it was cooling, they were changing the material properties and the adhesive in there, and that was what was causing the materials to crack. So logically, you would think you would bake it before you started. Don't bake. Don't make that same mistake. And then the story, you can do everything right and something still can go wrong with Flex, right? This is an application that I was involved with. So it was a pretty complex rigid Flex design, had polyimide rigid materials as well as the Flex. And it was about a 2-year design cycle that we went through, and everything, was going kind of as expected. A lot of different iterations. It was, like I said, a complex design, multiple surface finishes, tight traces, tight annular ring, just a lot of things going on that board. But it was also a really good example of, design, fabrication, the assembly person. It's an FDA-approved part. The consultant for all of that was also involved in all of these conversations back and forth, over a couple of years' time. So we're all excited, got the final design approved, did the pre-production stuff. We got the first production order, a few thousand pieces, built it, shipped it, and again, hey, Tara, got some problem here, something's not going right. They had noticed during assembly that some of the parts were just a slightly different color, and on top of further investigation, the texture was just slightly different also. So we're like, all right, we're not sure what's happening. Send some of those parts back for samples. We send them out, to our labs, do all kinds of research. But again, the communication that we've opened up over that couple years was really helping us to speed this process along. At the end of the day, found out that it was mesoling in the polyimide material, which is fairly common, does happen. IPC addresses it, doesn't violate the IPC spec in any way. So, the board was built to print. It should have been just fine, but that slight texture variation was determined to going to impact the patient that was going to be experiencing this circuit, and had to go back and redesign the whole spec. They can't change material. It's now FDA submitted and approved. So tightened up the spec, and now we're building and basically inspecting and sorting for mesoling. So yeah, everything should have been going right. Something still went wrong. But the important thing I think in this story too is communication is so important. It'd be so easy to say, hey, fabricator, what'd you do wrong? Like, there's something wrong here, but there was none of that. It's very problem solving, and it was just a really good example of that, I thought. And somebody wanted me to point out the everything but the kitchen sink story. So it's not uncommon for me to hear from purchasing people, please do not tell my designers what your leading edge is. Because they're going to design to it, and they're going to design just past it, and it's just going to be headaches for me, right? It's going to be expensive. You're not going to deliver on time. It's going to, it's just don't do it here all the time. And there's a little bit of truth to that, right? We all like to push the edges, and that's fine, absolutely fine to design to the edge. But when you design multiple attributes at the cutting edge, the accumulating factor on that yield goes up very quickly. They like to say, rough rule of thumb, for every attribute that you push to that leading edge, it's going to be a yield hit of 3 to 5, 7%, something like that at that leading edge. Well, when you start adding in heavy copper, tight annular ring, tight space and trace, maybe via fill, maybe stacked microvias, that's going to add up really quickly to a 30 to 40% yield hit. Your prices are going to go up, yields are going to go down. So try to be careful of not throwing in everything but the kitchen sink in the designs. So one of the other things that I did prior to this was went out and asked some fabricators, what do you wish every designer knew about Flex? And actually, if you go out on the Altium resource page, I have a series of blogs that are going to be not this advice necessarily, but a bunch of other stories that I have accumulated. The first thing that came up was the data packages, right? Honestly, I think 95% or even more of new part numbers go on hold when they go into engineering. But 60 to 65% of those are just from simple data package issues. So it can be the most complex design in something very simple, throws it on hold. So they're cautioning me to please share, to look at the data packages before submitting, making sure all the files are there, the drill files, the circuit files, the net list, the fab drawing are all included, and that the rev levels match. So the drill files are an A and the circuit's B, right? Something like that, because it's going to go on hold right away. And then talking about the fab drawing. So first of all, please always include the fab drawing because it makes my job so much easier. I know I'm not always able to pull up the Gerber files and look at them from my phone. But within that fab drawing, there's a lot of gotchas that we see, common issues, right? The drill chart doesn't match the data. That's very common. Or there's an impedance note called out on the drawing, but that trace is not in the data. Trace size is not in the data anywhere. Or the outline is another thing that often doesn't match for whatever reason, right? So they wanted me to pass that along, that the devil's in the details, and pay attention to that data package. And also, specialized fabrication techniques required for flex. So it's, I hear it a lot. Flex is expensive, right, Tara? I'm like, well, it is. It's a little more expensive than rigid. The materials themselves are more expensive, but there's also specialized processing that needs to happen when you're working with flex. So if you can imagine processing an 18 by 24 inch flex panel that's maybe 2 mils thick, a piece of paper, and trying to keep that from getting any dents or dings in that copper at all, because the second that panel drops, it's going to get a little dent or pit in that copper. That's going to be scrap at some point when you create your traces, right? So a lot of work goes into handling and racking and how to put it in trays and things like that. That's one step. The equipment that we use is often conveyorized as well, and those thin flex panels want to get wrapped up in those rollers, right? So fabricators will tape and untape FR4 leader boards to each of those panels prior to running it through some of this equipment. I also wanted to talk about panelization with the flex materials. Because they are more expensive and because flex comes in a lot of unusual shapes, it's always a good practice to pay a little bit of attention up front to how you might be able to nest those parts or reverse nest them, L-shaped, anything with a curve. You're able to nest those and get more parts up on your panel. So if you're creating the array, keep that in mind, definitely. Or give it to your fabricator and ask them, what's the optimum way to panelize the board to help, bring the cost down.
So panelization will help bring the cost down when you're going to
Yeah, the greater number of parts you can put on that production panel, the lower your cost is going to be. And typically, the panel sizes are going to be 18 by 24 or 12 by 18 with an inch border around the outside for coupons and tooling holes.
So the inch border is in addition to the panel size and the optimized tools.
Actually, it's 16 by 22. Yeah. And then somebody passed along the impact of hybrid materials. So let's take a complex rigid flex that's using specialized material, maybe ceramic-filled materials. Those materials, as with flex, have a lot of issues with movement. So flex on its own is very hydroscopic. It's going to absorb moisture. The panels are going to shrink and grow, depending, especially if you're in Minneapolis, where I'm from. It's going to be really, really dry in the winter, really humid in the summer. The materials move around in different ways. So flex on its own is not going to be able to have the same tight tolerances that we're used to with rigid boards. Right? You get a little greater tolerances for trace, line width and space, and annular ring, and things like that. Then combine that with a ceramic-filled rigid material in your rigid flex. That ceramic-filled material has the same kind of issues, right? It has scaling issues, and you put those two together, it can be a very complex design. So what will often happen is a scout lot will be run. So they'll take one panel, run it through the entire facility, and then scale the tooling to match how those materials moved and shifted. Which is great. I mean, it definitely improves yield, and it's a good practice, but it does take extra time that needs to be planned into the project, and it is expensive to run that scout lot through. And because I wanted to talk about some of the basics, I thought it would be good to throw it in right after that really complex hybrid rigid flex I just talked about. And when you go to flex basics, a couple of the things that I wanted to point out as good practice are avoid the I-beam effect, right? Make sure that you're staggering your conductors from top to bottom whenever possible so that you're putting less stress on that circuit when it's flexing. And then be very mindful of the bend transition areas, right? Make sure that you are not, that everything's gonna be perpendicular to the fold, that you don't have plated through holes in that bend area. Just be very mindful of keeping that just a nice perpendicular area. And material selection is critical. We had talked about earlier the different materials that were available. We've also talked about bend radius, all something to keep in mind. But other things to think about when you're looking at your material selection is how is the flex going to be used? Is it going to be flex to install, or is it going to be dynamically flexing? That will all have an impact on the materials that you choose. And is there going to be a UL requirement for this material? Do you need to use flame retardant materials? Again, something to keep in mind when you are selecting your material. And I think the thing that's also very important is to really have a good understanding of the materials that your fabricator works with. Because I can sit at a presentation like this and give you general feedback that the adhesive-based, 1 ounce copper on 2 mil polyamide is going to be probably less expensive than an adhesiveless material is going to be. And in general, that's true. But if your fabricator does more rigid flex than straight up flex, they may stock a lot more of that adhesiveless materials. So it's going to be less expensive because there's going to be more material. They'll purchase greater amounts of it, the price will go down. It could be less expensive in that case. So again, really good to know what your fabricator prefers to work with. And then here's a great story of something I learned getting ready for this presentation. I did know that the transition area between the rigid and the flex is very critical, right? It's a critical portion of that design. And I have for years heard and reiterated to people, keep all your plated through holes at least 50 mils from that edge and that transition. And that's because you don't want any acrylic adhesive to be involved in any of those plated through holes, right? So talking to somebody and asking them about that, and they said, Tara, I don't know why you guys all stand up and say 50. Because really it creates a lot of extra work for me. The fabricator telling me this, right? The design, or the manufacturing engineer. I said, oh really? I didn't know that. He's like, yeah, you guys all say 50 and it just causes me trouble. Tell everybody 100. So if at all possible, keep your plated through holes 100 mils away from the edge, just to help the fabricator out. And the same thing, he kind of educated me on the transition area. See, I had to write it down because this is a whole new number for me and I didn't want to forget it when I was up here. But we always talk about keeping like a keep out zone, right, in that transition area of 30 mils. Like don't route your traces in that area, just keep it a nice clean transition area. All those materials stacking up, tolerances, it's nice to have that area clear to not cause any yield issues. Uh-huh.
Isn't there a flexible adhesive that's typically used also at that transition point? That is Eco-Bond.
That's coming up. Yeah, but you're right. You're right. I have some pictures of that too. So while I was always telling people a 30 mil keep out, this manufacturing engineer said, Tara, please tell them 60. You can even say 59, but if you can keep everything within 59 mils of that transition area, it'll be so much easier on the fabricator. Now, I know that's not always possible. You can go with the 50 and you can go with the 30 that we talk about all the time, but if you have the ability to give your fabricator a break, they would appreciate it. And then, after I spoke with fabricators, I went out and asked some of my friends who are flex designers what kind of advice they had. What should everybody know? And this one, I can't believe I didn't know this. I've been doing this for 20 years. It's the first time I heard this. This example, which I made a cartoon because I'm not good at drawing things, but this was a 28-layer rigid flex with 5 different flex bands. So very, very complex design. IPC class 3. As I mentioned, the coupons go around the outside of that panel. It's not unheard of that the coupons fail and the boards are good, right? And so the typical process for that is to use a referee board. Generally, you're taking a good board, destructively testing it, and having to throw that away as the referee. But on the edges of the panel, sometimes with copper distribution, the coupons behave differently than the parts. So this person brought up this great plan. What he does is he throws, wherever there's room, in the middle of the panel, additional sets of coupons. So that way, if the coupons on the edge of the board are not representing the part, you can use the coupons as a referee from the center of the panel rather than having to destruct a board. And in his case, a 28-layer rigid flex, that was probably a few $1,000s that they saved by adding those coupons in. And then strain relief. So as you mentioned, it's best practice to put a layer of, or a bead of epoxy at that flex and rigid transition point. Put that on the fab drawing as a requirement. It's very common practice with rigid flex. Somebody did tell me a cautionary tale when we were talking about this, though. They happened to have an outgassing requirement that exceeded the NASA spec and started having to research materials to be able to use a different type of EcoBond. They did that, it was applied, ran through assembly, and it just disappeared. It completely wiped off the board. So what they had selected was just not compatible with the assembly process. The cautionary tale was make sure when you're looking at new materials that you're looking from start to finish and take all of the processes into account. Did also mention that if you have this epoxy on there and for whatever reason you do need to remove it, if you soak it in isopropyl alcohol long enough, it'll come off. And then grain direction. We talked about that a little bit in the first example that I talked about. But I was told when it really matters, be sure that you are putting the grain direction requirement on your fab drawing for your fabricator. Rolled annealed copper is going to have an inherent grain direction when it's used. So if your fabricator knows how your flex is bending and knows that it's a requirement, they can orient the parts on the panel when they're fabricating so you're bending with the grain direction of the material. And a good piece of advice that I had not heard until I had this conversation was that it's even more important with half-ounce copper. Just due to the properties of the material, 1 ounce copper is going to be more ductile than half-ounce copper. So as you go to half-ounce copper and shorter traces, so tighter bend areas, definitely pay attention to the grain direction. And then managing material trade-offs. There's always going to be decisions that have to be made. Do you use liquid photoimageable cover lay? Do you use polyimide cover lay? If you need a liquid photoimageable cover lay can define those tight features that you're going to need. Polyimide is going to be more flexible. If you need a flexible cover lay with those tight feature areas, go ahead and have that cover lay laser cut. But it's a trade-off. It's a little bit more expensive. And then flex with stiffeners or rigid flex. When do you transition? It's typically going to be when the component density it gets to be too great for the flex material, or if you need very dense components on both sides of that, go ahead and use a rigid flex. And I'm going to skip over the next examples because I think I'm running out of time. The power of tear stops was something else that was brought up and kind of jokingly said stack the deck if you're able, right? So there's a good example right there of adding just a nice copper piece to the corner to make that a little bit more robust. Also not uncommon, as you see in that picture, to have material slit on the flex so you're able to fold it in multiple directions. In that circular area where that drilled hole is, make sure you're putting copper around the edge of that to help give that a little more robustness. And if you have room, go ahead and do dummy traces around the outside of that circuit. Did you have a question?
Yeah, do you have any suggestions for designs that have a requirement for no floating copper? In that case, there will be floating copper, right? Connecting to a ground or something.
Right, that's just non-functional copper.
But you said it's not connected to anything.
Right.
A lot of my designs, I'm not allowed to have.
Oh. You could, if you are concerned that that could be a weak area, you could also put like a piece of FR4 stiffener on the outside of that, or a polyimide stiffener. Actually, polyimide might work a little bit better because you can cut it with the outline of the part. And then don't overlook the resource for impedance with your fabricator. So there's a lot of tools out there to help you anticipate impedance and work through your stack-ups. But fabricators' tools are a little more sophisticated, and they're constantly adding the results from all of the materials and designs that they build into that, so it can be a little more precise. And I'm always going to recommend to use your fabricator for a stack-up. So if you have impedance requirements and things like that, it's a great resource. Oops. And then stay on top of new technology. So there's a lot of new technology coming out on the market right now, a lot of new materials that we're hearing about, a lot of processes that are just coming into development here. So lots of things going on. One in particular, I'm showing a very small circuit here. So there's an additive process that's gotten a lot of attention, especially since our iPhones had come out. The iPhone 10, I think, teardown had the 30 micron trace in space being done with modified semi-additive processing. That's in high volume offshore. There's a semi-additive process that is gaining momentum here in the United States for low volume development type stuff, and that's able to go to 25 micron, even down to 5 micron trace in space. So frees up a lot in terms of routing, number of layers, number of lamination cycles that you need, not to mention form factor. We're doing things on tips of catheters, neural probes. It's going to be probably a game changer in the next few years, just having that ability and added benefit. And then I just wanted to finish with what I consider a huge success story. Told a lot of war stories today, but this one is a huge success. So just to set up this scenario behind it, this was a large Mill Aero Prime. They were about to hit a high dollar value milestone in their project, needed to ship product on a very specific time frame. Rigid boards were all installed, the rigid flex got installed, and about a week to go, they realized that they had overlooked routing to the outside for the test nodes. Now what, right? But everybody got their head together, and the designer flew to the OEM, sat down with everybody, got out the caliper. Actually, somebody had at their desk an old x-ray from a broken bone. They cut that up and made that into their mock-up. They were measuring it, they notched it, wrote all over the pinout, so no matter how it was bending or folding, they knew when they went to go to do this design, it was going to be correct the first time. The designer flies home. Now it's a holiday weekend. Over that weekend, he designed the 3 flexes that they needed. Before that, called the fabricator, said, hey, what material do you have? What should I use? Could you please set it aside and allocate it, which they did. They brought somebody in on the Monday evening when the designs were finished, so it could be tooled. Parts ran on a 24-hour turn. They shipped Monday afternoon to assembly. The assembler was all keyed up waiting for it. They too did a 24-hour turn. By Thursday morning, the OEM had parts in hand, installed them, everything went great. So they designed, fabbed, and assembled 3 flex circuits in less than a week. And that's really the power of communication and really bringing everybody together and working together. So that was the success story that I wanted to share at the end. And is there any questions? Oh, and the people who did ask questions, come on up and find me, because there's tickets for a drawing, and she will explain what that's for.
Does anybody have questions? Now that you know about the extra tickets. Entries into the raffle. Do we have cake? Okay.
So whenever you have the grain of the copper in the flex, which way does the grain go? The grain go with the flex?
Yes.
Or, okay, all right.
Yep. Okay.
I just wondered if this presentation's available to us.
Yeah.
take home.
Judy, will it be available later?
Yeah, we'll make them available after the conference. We'll turn them into PDFs for you, and then we'll make them available along with the video on our website, and we'll be able to get an email from us.
Yeah. When you were talking about plated through holes from the edge, I'm assuming you also mean vias, not just
Yes.
okay.
Yep, exactly. And not 50, 100.
Anybody on this side?
Yeah, sorry if this is a silly question, but what are coupons?
Oh, so on the edge of the panel, they're used for testing all the different attributes. So IPC class 2, IPC class 3. They simulate the board. Connectivity, yep.
Got one?
We had an issue with delamination. Because we were using a solid ground plane, so they recommended using a hatched, kind of ground plane. So do you have any knowledge of that? Or?
Can we talk just after, and I can ask just a few more questions? And I might be able to answer that a little bit better.
Got a question here.
Thanks. Maybe I missed this, but it seems like there's difficulty with solid ground planes going across. It can make it very stiff and crack. Yeah. So, do you have a rough estimate on signal integrity or this? What signals you probably shouldn't put over rigid flex versus what you are okay. I guess it should just is gigabit just bad news or what have you seen?
I don't know the answer to that question on where you would not want to crosshatch and where it's okay. Mike, you were nodding your head. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, but what I would say is always want to cross-hatch, okay? But run a shadow ground trace right through the crosshatch. And then you get a perfect uninterrupted return path. But keep in mind that flex can be very thin, so therefore you're going to probably have a thin trace to get the correct impedance you want. But you want to be very careful what signals you're sending across. I mean, RFs are pretty tough to send across a flex because they want to be wide and non-lossy. So really think it through and simulate it, and definitely do it up front before you just design it and then check.
And I'm coming over here to Ginger. Got red hair.
I had a question. We do high temperature stuff, so what kind of rigid flex would you recommend for high temperature? We do 180.
Probably adhesive-less. Is that what you're asking? What type of flex materials?
Yes, because we do 180C.
Yeah, in the laminate, I would go with an adhesive-less laminate. The adhesive material is going to be the first thing that's impacted by heat.
Well, this may be a continuation of what he said. Have you ever done any work with people doing heating elements in flex circuits?
What do you mean?
Just, having a heating element built into a flex circuit.
Oh, like a heater?
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely possible. There's a couple good companies I could recommend that do that regularly.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So we do the high temp, as my colleague said. So we need to bake the board. We need to test the board. So you would recommend baking it after you put it in the final position, or because we have to make sure all the circuit works before at
So you're
150.
forming it, like the example that I had said with the forming?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, not
so-
forming it, but basically we need to do the heat test at a final stage. So we cannot do it, as you said, it's not recommended before you put it in its final position, right? So we can,
Right. So bend it and then bake it.
and then bake it. Okay.
Yep.
For you.
So you mentioned about the strain relief epoxy, low outgassing, and I think you gave examples of how it's washing away, but do you have any recommendations of low outgassing epoxies used for strain relief that would work well?
I don't know what material he selected. I probably have it written down, and I could get that information for you, because they did find one that did work. I just don't know what it is, but I can certainly ask.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Okay,
Great.
so we're at the end of the presentation. Let's thank Tara for a great job today.